I'm just going to say a short welcome to everyone before I bring Leah and Emma on screen, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a moment. First of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you who are coming back from last week's session, and also welcome to all of you for whom this is the first in the course that you're attending. Tonight's talk is co-hosted between Jewish Renaissance and the Lions Learning Project. It's also in association with Insiders Outsiders, and we're very grateful to Monica Bohm-Duchesne, their director, for curating the programme. Jewish Renaissance, as many of you know, is the national Jewish arts and culture magazine. And we're really delighted that Lions Learning have helped us fund some new adult education series. This is a part of one called Spies, Lies and Secret Missions, the unsung heroes, the unsung Jewish heroes of World War II. And we're having a series of events that are about all the stories that weren't really talked about. Particularly, we're looking at the roles of those emigres and refugees from Nazi Germany or from Nazi Europe, who then ended up working to support the British and Allied war effort. With us tonight is Leah Garrett, who is an absolute expert in this field, but I'm going to leave it to Emma to introduce her properly. Emma Brand, who's going to be chairing the conversation this evening, is the new programming officer for Jewish Renaissance, programming producer, sorry, for Jewish Renaissance. And she was, and still is, the programmer for Lions Learning. She's the person who's managing the relationship between both of us. So I'm really delighted that Emma, who is both an experienced Jewish educator through Limud, and also a wonderful actor, some of you might have seen her in the Sit Sit Fringe Festival recently, is going to chair tonight. I'm going to invite her on screen, and she's going to be in conversation with Leah for about 35 to 40 minutes. We're then going to bring you all into the conversation. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you could put a note in the chat to Jewish Renaissance, that's me, I'm Aviva, the director of Jewish Renaissance. But if you put the note in the chat to Jewish Renaissance, it will come to me. And then during the Q&A session, we will invite you to come on screen and ask Leah, or to unmute yourself if you don't want to be visible on camera, and to ask Leah any questions you've got. So please do put notes into the chat, and we will be monitoring those throughout the evening. But now, without further delay, I'm going to bring Emma up and ask her to introduce Leah Garrett, who we're very delighted to say is our speaker for the evening. Emma, over to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And now it's my turn to introduce Leah. So Leah is a professor and director of Jewish Studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. She has published 5 books in Jewish Studies and has won or been shortlisted for numerous literary prizes. Extroop, which we'll be discussing today, has been featured on CNN, Time Magazine, The Guardian, and a range of other publications. And it's received rave reviews from The Telegraph, The Times, and The Jerusalem Report, and it's now being translated into Hebrew, Polish, and Russian. And I just wanted to add my own rave review. I found it really gripping. There's moments of really jaw-dropping military detail, but it also packs a powerful emotional punch. And I found myself quietly crying behind my mask on the tube on more than one occasion whilst reading it. So it's really exciting to have you here and to be able to ask you questions about the book. So for anyone who hasn't read it yet, I wonder if you could just start by giving a kind of overview. Who were Extroop and what is the general kind of scope of the book?
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me. So Extroop were a secret commando unit that were created in 1942 by Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten when the war wasn't going so great for the British. And they felt that they had to do something pretty radical here to turn the tide of the war. So what they decided that they would do was create something called the Inter-Allied 10 Commando, which was a bigger commando unit comprised of smaller commando units, like a Polish unit for Poles who were in the UK and wanted to go back and fight the British. And there was a French troop, there was a Belgian troop. But they also decided that they would create a German-speaking troop, which would officially be called 3 Troop or X Troop. And the thing about the British troop was it wasn't really going to be comprised of Brits. It was going to be comprised of German speakers. And what they hadn't really reckoned with was that the majority of the German speakers in 1942 who are in Germany, who want to go back and fight Germans and Nazis, are Jewish refugees. So I'm sure we'll get into all the details of it, but almost every single member of the troop, there's 87 of them, were born in either Germany or Austria, had come to the UK, usually as teenagers by themselves, when their parents were trying to save them, often on kinder transport or through a transit visa program. And then when they got to the UK, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but at first it was okay, then it got pretty bad when the Brits interred Germans, but eventually they were selected for this top secret commando unit that I argue was absolutely crucial to the British winning the war.
So in your introduction, you talk about this as a tale that needed to be told, but it hadn't been so far. So I wonder where you found X Troop and why you decided to keep following the stories of these individual men.
So my last book had been called Young Lions, how Jewish American writers rewrote the American War novel. And it was all about Jewish Americans who served in World War II and then became famous authors like Joseph Heller and Herman Wouk and a bunch of names we all know. And I'd gotten to World War II because my grandfather, Abraham Klein, had served in the war. My great uncles had all served in the war. Everyone I knew who was Jewish had served in the war. And I felt like there wasn't enough discussion of how crucial Jews were actually fighting against Germans and Nazis, and that it was underreported, that the sort of common thing that everyone was comfortable with was sort of Jewish victims, but nobody was talking enough about the Jewish actors who fought back. So after I wrote that book, I knew I still wanted to write about World War II. And I'd heard that there was I had heard these rumors of the secret commando unit of Jews. And so when I started to research it, I was stunned that, first of all, no one had written the book because it was so important to the war, but also that there was so much material. So I found all this material in the Imperial War Museum at Kew, and then Holocaust Museum here. I got in touch with Commando children. I got in touch with eventually Commandos themselves, which was incredible, and got to interview them. And so from the minute I sort of decided this was going to be the project, it went really quickly because there was just so much stuff to gather and so much material out there that was just waiting for somebody to put it together into a book.
You've touched on this a little bit, the kind of narrative of Jewish victims being more acceptable than Jewish fighters, I suppose. And yeah, I found that quite difficult when I was reading it, this sense that they were so important and they were so, elite in what they were doing and so crucial to various victories that we do know about. And yet they've kind of been erased. And do you feel that that's because they were Jewish, or?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay, so that's so interesting, that question. So look, I went through all the official documentation around this troop. There was never the word Jewish used about them. It was always German speakers or people, it took years for them to get naturalized. The British government naturalized the Poles, naturalized the French troop, wouldn't naturalize these guys. So I think the reality was that there was certainly, with some people in the British government, some cloaked anti-Semitism because it was very obvious that they were all Jewish. But I think that was more of a minor thing. I think the real reason that the story hadn't been told was because this was a completely top secret unit. During the war, nobody knew about their existence. And I didn't mention this. So when they're selected for X Troop, they're interviewed by MI5 and they're interviewed by the British government. And then after the group is selected, of above about 90 of them, they're all given about 10 minutes in which they all have to come up with fake British names, fake British backstories about why they have German accents. They're all given Church of England dog tags, so they're going to be buried under crosses. And so nobody actually knew publicly, except for one secretary at MI5 knew, nobody else knew that this troop, which was officially called the British troop, which is ridiculous, was actually the German speaker troop comprised of Jews. So the other reason that the story never got out, I mean, it got out in dribs and drabs with pieces here and there, was because it was so top secret. And after the war, many of the men, in fact, most of the men kept their fake British names. Many of their men never told their kids their true stories. Many of the kids I interviewed said that they didn't realize they were Jewish till they went to a cousin's bar mitzvah. And then they were like, wait, why is my cousin Jewish? Dad, do you have something to tell me? So it was like the families kept the cloak of secrecy. And many of them, I think, wanted to protect their kids. They were still scared because, fascism rose up again, unfortunately, in the UK in 1940. Mosley's party comes back twice. So people are still pretty nervous, I think. But it was particularly problematic because and I just want to mention this because something amazing just happened with this, because, they're Church of England, they're all pretending to be British. They're all pretending not to be Jewish. And so those who are actually killed during the war, like I said, are buried under crosses. And so since, for 2 decades now, there's been this historian in the UK, I'm sure some of you know his name, Martin Sugarman. He's a complete star, totally dedicated to getting these guys under crosses to be under Stars of David. And it's been contentious because some of the families actually don't want that because it's so secretive. But on last Sunday, I was sent a Zoom link because somebody who'd read the book contacted me and said, look, my commando relative is buried under a cross and we don't want that to be anymore. Is there any way you can help? I just read your book. So I put that person in touch with Martin Sugarman and he put them in touch with another agency. And on Sunday, I was crying my eyes out from start to finish on Zoom. They reinterred this ex-trooper from being under a cross to this beautiful Star of David, and they did a full military funeral for him. And that was just Sunday. So my hope with this book, and I do hope people buy the book, it's called Extroop, because I want people to know about Jews fighting back, also is to write the narrative with World War II and remind everyone that there was this incredibly important Jewish force. And just one more point about it. So when the book came out, because I'd done so much archival work to get the story out, and there was so much material, as I said, they ended up actually serializing the book in the UK in the Daily Mail. It was serialized. It was like, it got incredible coverage over there. And I think a lot of it was because nobody could believe that there were, none of us can believe there's still stories of World War II that none of us know about. But for me, it was so important that this was a Jewish story and it was about Jews fighting back. So that's a long answer for your question. It's such a good question, but I think it's a combination of all these different forces going on.
It must be amazing to be the person that people would reach out to as the holder of this story,
It's been incredible. Oh my, I get emails every morning. I open up my email and I get an email from somebody. Generally, it's people who have connections who are Jewish to World War II. It's every once in a while it's an ex-trooper, but that has been so incredibly meaningful to get these emails. And I was speaking to one of the ex-troop kids a few days ago because I got to know all the families because I interviewed them all for the book, all the ones I could. And he was telling me that he had just read the book a second time because there was all this stuff in the book about his dad that he didn't know. And I kept hearing that from ex-trooper kids because I was able to go into the war diaries and tell their stories. And I was able to have the bigger narrative. And these kids had grown up knowing their dads were heroes, but not knowing about the Holocaust, not knowing their parents' ties to the Holocaust generally. So that has been the most satisfying thing imaginable, was helping families understand the stories of their own dads.
Wow. So you mentioned the bigger story and the bigger picture. So maybe we should take things back a few steps for the benefit of people here. Could you say a little bit more about, how the Extroopers were formed? Where they came from, and yeah, what they then went on to do.
Right. So, like I said, so hundreds and hundreds and thousands of these young Jews come on the trains and find a way to get to the UK because their parents have this impossible decision to do this because it's the only way to save their kids. And so when war breaks out, and it's interesting, I have found with British audiences, people don't know this as much as Americans know about what we did to the Japanese. Churchill infamously says, color the lot of them, and they decide what they're going to do because of the press was quite xenophobic at this point, was saying that there might be a fifth column in the UK, not thinking of the fact that 85% of the Germans are Jews. So they decide that they're going to do these tribunals and interview all of the Germans. Again, not thinking they're mostly Jews. And they decide that they're going to lock up the most dangerous group, which are single men. And like all the ex-troopers have come as single men. So basically every single ex-trooper first ends up being interred. Often, most of them at the Isle of Man, which was terrible, and it was behind barbed wire and they were out of touch of their family. I mean, it was just terrible. And a number of them in the most horrific circumstances when they were sent to Canada and to Australia on the Daenerys ship, which was a voyage of the damned. It was pure hell. So they're all interred for up to a year until they're allowed to be released. They all want to join the military. They want to fight the Germans. They're only allowed into the Pioneer Corps, which is a non-combat corps. They're not allowed to have guns because they're still enemy aliens officially. And they're agitating to get out and fight the Germans. Eventually in 42, right around the time of, in the summer of 1942, Churchill makes the decision that they're going to do this new troop. And that's when they start getting these notices and requests to come to London and be interviewed by MI5 and others. And then the best of the best are chosen and they're sent to Wales to be trained for about a year because their commanding officer is this incredible Welshman, not Jewish, Brian Hilton Jones. And so then they go to Aberdofi in Wales, which I can never pronounce correctly. And they're billeted with local Welsh families, which is completely ridiculous because these guys are like from these cultured Viennese families. They've never been around. I mean, they're all pretending to be British. They all have these fake names that they can't remember. They can't let anyone know that they're Jewish. And they do their training for a year with Brian Hilton Jones. And he makes the decision that they're going to be unique in multiple ways, but in the most important way is they're going to be trained as commandos. So they're going to be trained to kill and capture Germans, but they're also going to be trained in counterintelligence to interrogate Germans when they're captured so that they can make battlefield decisions and figure out what to do in the next moments. So they get the most in-depth training of just about anybody in the British Army because they're getting the dual trainings at the same time.
So what I found really interesting was that they seem to be chosen as well as for physical attributes, mental attributes. They're chosen because they're hungry and they're angry and they really want to fight. And yet the way you've described them and, the time that they spent in Wales, there's a really, charming description of how they fitted into the town and everyone loved them because they were so nice.
Nice.
Yeah, but they are cultured and intelligent and brave and yet so ethical. And I wondered if you ever came across anything. I mean, everything that you write about the Extroopers in the book, they seem like these idealized kind of men. And is that just how you found all the Extroopers to be, the ones who have been chosen?
I did actually find that to be. It's really interesting. And the thing you said about them burning with a desire, when they interviewed them, they were actually looking specifically for that. So they were looking for three things. They were looking with a burning desire. They were looking for being very physically adept. They wanted the guys who were winning the running competitions and stuff in the Pioneer Corps. And they were looking for high intelligence because they need that for the counterintelligence work. So they end up picking like the best of the best. And one thing that they said over and over again in all of their post-war interviews, in every situation, I mean, they were in impossible situations in which like they were interrogating like someone from Auschwitz who might have killed their mother, or, you know, one guy finds out who actually got his own dad killed. And over again, they said that a primary motivating force for them was that we're not like them. And what that meant was, we Jews are not like those Germans. They're the monsters. We are the ethical people. And so it was really, I write about this in the book when Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds came out, about this revenge group of Jewish commandos. They were horrified by it. And I read all their letters to each other, because they said, that's not how we did things. They kept control over that. I do talk in the book about one moment in which one ex-trooper is interrogating a German and he hits him, but the other ex-trooper, that because he's so angry at this point about what the Nazis have done, the other ex-trooper then steps in and says, we don't do that. And that's what happened. They didn't do that. That was really unusual. And the other thing about the burning desire is that for every single ex-trooper, every single one of them, they need to win the war because they need to rescue family members. So the reason that they end up being such effective and incredibly important warriors and changing the tide of World War II, being at the tip of the spear, making all of these crucial, important captures of Germans and German sites, is because it was personal for them. This was a personal war. And every day that went on was another day. One of the guys that talked about his sister's hiding in France during the war, where his sister could be, he already has lost his parents. His sisters can be caught the next day unless we get this war going. So in every situation, they were the ones putting their hands up to volunteer for the most dangerous missions because of the personal aspect of the war. And that's exactly, very brilliantly, what the British military were looking for.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the kinds of things they volunteered for, and, you know, the
right.
kind of roles that they played, especially, you know, in D-Day and in securing the lines from Antwerp. I mean, these were, I couldn't believe what I was reading, that they were, you know, so crucial to what.
Yeah, they're so crucial. Yeah, and I think actually that's the reason that the book's been serialized so much in the British press, because it alters the story of what we think we know about World War II. If you throw these guys in so quickly during the training, the British military now realizes, God, these guys are insanely capable. And they're so capable, we're actually not going to allow Extroop to fight as its own force for two reasons. One is, if there's a bomb, we're going to lose half of them. We cannot, this is too crucial. The other reason is because what we're going to do instead is put them in groups of like 2 to 6 to existing commando units, to be the front of the commando unit, to be the guys who will go do advanced intelligence behind enemy lines, who will be the leaders of all the other commando units. So that's what ends up happening. So before the war happens, a number of them are sent on top secret missions behind enemy lines. I start by writing about one guy named George Lane, who's actually sent to capture mines along the Normandy coast so they can see what the Germans are using. And he does that on like a little rubber dinghy and he knows how dangerous it is. But his military citation says, but for the actions of George Lane, D-Day would not have gone on his plan. So it starts before D-Day. Then a bunch of them are selected to go to Sicily, and they're like right at the front of all the Sicily Italian campaign. But the majority of them land at D-Day on Sword Beach. And because of their language, because of their burning passion, because of their intelligence, from the moment they land, they are capturing scores and scores of Germans right there because they're so burning. But then really even more crucially, they're interrogating them right as they capture them, and they're finding out where the mines are laid, how do we move forward, where are the machine gun nests. So they're doing 2 roles. And one of them who lands at Sword Beach is this guy, Peter Masters, who I focus on, very lovely, beautiful artist from Vienna, who, you know, has to come on the train like all of them do. And when he lands at Sword Beach, he's chosen on the way to actually get the boats from Southampton to be with something called the Bicycle Troop, which he has had no training for. The Bicycle Troop is trained together for like a year, and he's given, and another reason to get the books is the photographs are insane. So I have a photograph of the guys landing at Sword Beach holding these bicycles, which are heavy, they fold, they have no pedals. As he said, whenever you're riding along, your backpack goes on the front of it. inevitably would push the brakes on you right while somebody's shooting a sniper at you. The reason that they're given these bikes, which are so awkward and terrible, is it's his mission, along with the bicycle troop, once they land at Sword Beach, to go in front of everybody, even before any minds are cleared, to get to Pegasus Bridge. And they're the first ones across Pegasus Bridge. Unlike The Longest Day, it's not Lord Lovett. It's Peter Masters, this Viennese Jew. And after I started writing the book, his family let me look at all of his letters, which were in his house. And I saw these amazing letters to Lord Lovett saying, hey, Lord Lovett, like, don't you remember, it wasn't really you, it was kind of me. And Lord Lovett like reluctantly agrees and says, yes, I have to admit, blah, blah. And he ends up saving Lord Lovett's life a few days later, which I write about in the book. So, so they go through Normandy, and then they also do all these other campaigns that I discuss, particularly the island of Walcheren, which has to be captured because the British and the Americans need another port in which to get supplies from. And they need Antwerp because all of the troops are being bogged down and they can't get supplies from them. They have to get Antwerp. But Hitler has unfortunately realized this as well. And he's packed thousands of troops on this little island called Walcheren, which you have to go by to get to Antwerp. And so it's a bunch of ex-troopers who are sent to get back Walcheren with other commando units. And again, are right at the front of the pack, capturing crucial positions. And it's two of them who in fact end up capturing the head of the Germans who are on the island and getting him to surrender, thus getting Walcheren, which means like a week later, they're going to get Antwerp as well.
And what I found remarkable as they go through these missions is, you know, you've got one commando capturing and escorting 200 German prisoners. Like they must have been pretty charismatic young men.
I say something about that, which was so cool about that I love, and that happens over and over again. And I have this moment in the book, I talk about one of the guys, Ian Harris, and I talk about this other guy, Montfort Gons, both who end up capturing hundreds, right? Oh, and Peter Masters too. So I have these three moments in the book where these ex-troopers have captured hundreds. And it's so cool because all of them had gone to German schools, right? Montfort Gons had gone to German school. Ian Harris had been unfortunately sent to a boarding school, which was like a Nazi ground, and Peter Masters. So it's so amazing. So when they capture the Germans, the way that they keep them all in line, I don't know how much I went into detail in the book about this, but was that they would do the orders that they remembered from primary school when all the kids would pretend to be in the military. And so they knew this stuff, they knew all the colloquial stuff, and all these Germans who are captured are going like, how is it that there's this British commando doing these orders to me, sounding like that childhood bully in my high school perfectly? And they knew it, the ex-troopers knew it. They always said like, it's just such a cool notion that those kids who bullied me as a Jew, now like I'm at the front of the pack telling them, you know, don't get out of the line or I'm going to shoot you, in colloquial German. So that's how they did that. It was the charisma, but it was more the childhood. It's so great. I mean, that's just so great of knowing how to interact with these people who were the people they grew up with, who became Nazis, of course.
But obviously on the flip side of that, having grown up German, having German accents, it seemed like there were many times on their missions where they just weren't listened to, where they were given the worst jobs. And it's, you know, that's the story throughout the book. Obviously, Nazism is there, it's in the background, and then comes at the end, it's very much in the foreground. But, you know, they are interned, they're given the worst army jobs, then they're sent on dangerous missions, and then they're not listened to, and then they're not naturalized. And did you ever get the sense that there was any bitterness, or did they understand what had happened to them and why?
Yeah, the naturalization struggles were really tough, and they felt really terrible about that, particularly because after the war, the British decide that these guys are going to be really good for the denazification efforts. So they're sending them back to Germany and Austria in 1945 and 1946 to root out Nazis, to get information for the Nuremberg trials. They're not naturalizing them. So they were really bitter about it. That particular moment was very bitter for them. But one of them, Ian Harris, he said after the war in one of the interviews, you know, and he should have gotten huge medals, and he got some medals, but he didn't get enough. And others were bitter that he didn't because of his Jewish background, but he said, you know, that something like the British gave me a gun. I'm eternally grateful to the British because they gave me a gun, they gave me a grenade, and they said, go on, boy, you know, go get Nazis or something like that. So they were really very, very mixed about it. And it's so interesting. When the book came out, I got all these amazing reviews, but my two favorite reviews, which came out the same day by British reviewers, one said, this book makes me really ashamed to be British. And the other said, this book makes me really proud to be British. So I think it was both. I think for the guys, it felt like both. But I think, though, to be honest with their experience, overall, profound gratitude and an ability to kind of not focus on that other stuff and just be so glad and grateful that they got to fight like this, because it didn't happen anywhere else. In America, they had something called the Ritchie Boys, who were Jewish German speakers, but they only did counterintelligence. They weren't commandos. These guys got to, you know, kill the Nazis and Germans and capture, like trying to fix the world. So I think overall it was gratitude, actually.
And I have to say, as a British Jew, it was conflicting reading. Definitely.
Yeah, very conflicting.
We're not very good at reckoning with our history in this country, but yeah.
And just one other thing about it, after the war, it's really interesting because, like I said, most of them keep their British names, right? But there was a real stark difference that the majority of those who emigrate to the United States, many of them go back to their German or Jewish names, and many of them raise their kids as Jews. For the majority of those who stay in the UK, they don't really raise their children Jewish, and they really distance themselves. One of their daughters said to me, my dad always wanted to be more British than the British after the war. So that's something I find interesting. I don't quite understand it, but there was some sense for those who went to America that they had more options to be Jewish than they did in the UK. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a question of the context of anti-Semitism in
both
countries.
Yeah.
So before we met you tonight, Aviva and I were talking about your book as a different kind of Holocaust book. I know you probably wouldn't call it a Holocaust book, but it's there. And I think the difference being that this is a book which has the Holocaust in it, but where Jews have agency. And you were talking about, you know, them being given guns and how grateful they were for the opportunity to fight. So I wonder if that occurred to you as you were writing it, how the Holocaust kind of played on your mind as you were writing about this period of history.
That's such a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. So I have to say, this was actually intended to be a Holocaust book, because what I was tired of with military histories about World War II, particularly by British writers, was it was like, I'm either going to write about World War II or I'm going to write about the Holocaust, except for this guy, Andrew Roberts, who's amazing. And he wrote Winds of War or something. And he wrote this big history that was both at the same time. But I felt like we don't enough talk that World War II and the Holocaust are the same thing. It's all happening in the same spaces. They're not a separate event. And I was really, really conscious that I wanted these Jewish soldiers to reflect both, because they're all Holocaust survivors, every single one of them. They all have, it's a super optimistic book because they're given guns and they rescue family members. All this great stuff happens, but they're still all Holocaust survivors. So in the epilogue of the book, I talk about what I learned from writing the book was that the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust was completely profound, that their kids were still experiencing it, even if their dads didn't want to talk about it. And so part of why that memorial on Sunday, I think it's part of why I was weeping so much, was it was also like a representation. And they had a full military group there. They did the bugle. It was incredible. But I was like, yeah, like when they put him under a Star of David, we're doing like a public reckoning of the Holocaust at the same time. Does that make sense? Because that person in particular had lost his parents in the Holocaust. So to state that they're Jews and to remember that they're Holocaust survivors, I think is probably a way that the book was a challenge to how those who knew about the 3 Troop wouldn't talk about it being a Jewish troop. And Martin Sugarman, this guy, kept saying to me, like, are you going to make sure you say they're Jewish? And I'm like, yeah, it's going to be like in the title. It's a Jewish troop. They fought as Jews. But the reason they're fighting as Jews is because they're all Holocaust survivors.
I have one last question for you, and maybe you've already kind of touched on it. But if anyone else has a question for Leah, please do write it in the chat while she gives the next answer. So as a final question, what was your main takeaway from researching and writing this? That's probably quite a big question. Yeah.
And it changes every day, honestly. So I think I've had a lot of different takeaways. One takeaway was I was writing it during lockdown. I was writing it when there was lots of crazy stuff happening here with Trump. I was writing it when all this stuff was going on in America. And the first takeaway I got as I was writing it was, God, these guys are such heroes, and they're focused on the prize. And they are just such an example of people taking control of their life if they're given the option to. The second takeaway I got about the book was when the United States was dealing with this whole crisis of immigrants at the southern border, when we still had Trump, and there was all this anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. So the article I wrote for CNN, I wrote an article for CNN about what did you take from it. And at that point, what I was taking from it was how important refugees are. And we need to realize these people know what evil and danger and terrible things look like, which is why we need them to remind us and how to make ourselves better. But then over the last 6 months or so, where at my university, which is City University of New York, there's been a rise in anti-Israel sentiment. There's been huge amounts of anti-Semitism here. BDS movement has somehow come to New York, which is just nuts for me. So the final take I've been getting out of it recently, as I've had to sort of fight all this anti-Semitic stuff, is, man, we got to remember the X-Troop, because these are some hard men who fought back, and that you just have to keep fighting back. So it's made me much more aggressive, their story recently, as I've been, which is another reason, get the book and get it for your kids, because we need to remind our children. I made my poor children read this book. They're teenagers, so they could deal with it. You have to, in my opinion, with what particularly I've been dealing with here in the States, Jews have to fight back, and we have to remember our stories of fighting back. So it's all changed as the political landscape has changed here. And I'm sure next year, if I'm asked, I'll say something completely different. But right now, it's the fighting back aspect of it that speaks most forcefully to me.
And I'm sure, having read it and taking some time to digest it, there'll be different things that occur to me in the coming weeks that are my main kind of memory.
Yeah.
Kind of gonna shift, I think. There is so much in the book. So yeah, if you haven't bought it yet, I'm gonna put a link in the chat later. But it's definitely well worth a read. So thank you so much, Leah, for your time today. I think we're gonna move on to some questions now, but I just want to say thank you as well before I am pulled down.
Those were fabulous questions. So thank you so much. And I love getting new questions I haven't had before. So I really enjoyed that. So thank you.
It was great to meet you. So I think Aviva is going to come back in with any questions.
Yeah, I will actually, my picture's not showing up for a moment. So I'm sorry if I'm a disembodied voice, but actually what I want to do is pull a couple of people up to ask questions themselves. We're having some really interesting ones coming in through the chat. So I'm going to ask Simon Albert, actually. Simon, would you either put your video on or unmute yourself? And Simon, do you want to ask Leah your question?
Hello, yes, hi. Thank you for your time today. My question was whether any of these unique commandos took their training and then served in Israel in 48 in the War of Independence, in the Machal or whatever other units.
Yeah.
I know some of them wanted to be more British than the British, but maybe there was one or two who didn't.
That's a really good question. And it's so interesting because, I did a Fulbright in Israel years ago where I studied Zionism at Tel Aviv University, like in the heart of sort of the Jewish Zionist endeavor in Tel Aviv. And I spent a year there. And it was so interesting to be there to talk about sort of the idea of the Jewish warrior and the idea of the Sabra and how, this idea is invented in Israel and in the 40s and these guys. And it was so interesting because these ex-troopers, I hate to say it, but they got there first and they were these guys. But after the war, as far as I could see, only a couple of them emigrated to Israel. And I have literally found no connection whatsoever with what these guys did and their training and then translating it over to Israel. And I think the reason is that for the majority of them, some of the men stayed in the British military after the war, a few of them, most of them just wanted a quiet life after the war. They wanted a good life. So Peter Masters goes to America. He gets a Fulbright to America to go to Yale, and he studies art. He always wants to be an artist. Another guy I talked about is really interesting, chemical engineering. He goes to MIT. So what they all do after the war is they live their most full lives as the person they wanted to be if this Holocaust war thing hadn't gotten in the way. And I couldn't find any connections whatsoever between this troop and then what happens in Israel afterwards. So it would have been great because these guys had so much knowledge they could have imparted, but I'm not sure I'm sure that the state of Israel was very important to many of them, but they'd had enough of fighting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really fascinating. Leah Elsie, another Leah has a question for you. Leah, did you want to unmute or start your video and ask it yourself?
Sure. Hello. That was really great to hear your talk. Thank you. It's interesting. This is the question that I have for you. So it's interesting to hear about their training in Wales. Did you visit or speak to local people about their experiences of the troops being there? And also, do you know if the village remembers or acknowledges their presence at the moment with a memorial or?
Oh, see, that's such a good question. I got literally chills up my arm. So I'll talk briefly about this. So I was planning to go there, but then lockdown happened and I couldn't go there. But the Welsh press covered the book, which is really important. I'll tell you why. So I think it was 1990, a number of the ex-troopers who were still alive decided that they wanted to create a memorial to the troop in Aberdowie. And I have a picture of the memorial they created, and they did a beautiful black granite memorial in Aberdowie. Unfortunately, the group who put it together was led by one of these people who was desperate for no one to know that he was British. He was Jewish. He was a very prominent judge at this point named Brian Grant. And he convinced his group that they wouldn't put the word Jewish on the memorial. So the word Jewish does not exist on the memorial. Martin Sugarman recently hired a local Jewish artist to create a bronze Star of David, which is now at the base of the memorial. And when people go to it, we ask them to leave Stars of David to remind the world that this was a Jewish troop. They also did a plaque in the seawall of Aberdowie, which wasn't this group, doesn't mention they're Jewish. And Aberdowie, unfortunately, also does a tourist brochure, which talks about the ex-troop and talks about how they came from a range of religions and backgrounds, doesn't mention they're Jewish. Martin Sugarman has been emailing with the town council there for 20 years. He sent me another email recently. They adamantly refuse to change any of it. So the main Welsh newspaper did an article about the book, but I just hope that the pressure at some point will make it break and there will be acknowledgement of who these men really were. So it's a really complicated and kind of terrible story. So if you do go there and you're interested, please, and so now if I have a picture of it in my book with a bunch of little Stars of David, and that's what people are doing as sort of a protest to this erasure of their true background. It's unbelievable and terrible.
That's fascinating. And I'm just wondering if we can get the Association of Jewish Refugees on it, because interestingly,
yeah.
Well, it's just interesting you've been talking about the Isle of Man, because JR, Jewish Renaissance, and the Insiders Outsiders and the Association of Jewish Refugees are going to be doing a trip there in March. It was actually meant to be earlier this year, but pandemic didn't allow it because it's the 80th anniversary of internment. Right. And we're actually going to put a blue plaque up, and we've got permission to put a plaque up, which for the first time is going to acknowledge, on the island outside the museum, that the enemy aliens that were interred were Jewish.
That's so great. That's so great.
I'm just wondering, maybe this should be our next project. But and
I'll put you in touch with. There's an incredible, wonderful Jewish academic, Nathan Abrams in Wales.
Oh, I know Nathan.
Yes, I did a talk for them. He did an article about it. So just yes, and It would be, but the town council is not backing down and has not backed down on it. And so they're not even changing the brochure, which to me like is the easiest thing. They won't do any of it.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I think I'm going to call to arms all of you watching tonight, but I seriously am going to get the AJR on it. That's brilliant. So I'm gonna, because we don't have huge amounts of time, and if there are any last questions from the audience, again, please do let us know. But I'm going to take chair's privilege to ask a question, because I know, because for example, my father, who was quite old when I was born, he was a soldier in World War II. He was a Jewish soldier, but his family had come over. He was actually the first child born in 1920, so he was considered English or British, and fought as a Jewish soldier. He fought in World War II. Was there a relationship between the refugee Jewish commandos and the British Jewish soldiers? Did they know each other? Was there any getting together after the war? Did they keep in touch and build relationships?
That's such a good question. So because all of these guys are put in 2s and 3s and 4s with existing commando units, right? They ended up getting to know their command, like 41 commander, they would get to know really well. So none of them were really, really committed to sort of post-war commando meetings. But, and I read through all the archives of all these guys, there was very little mention. In fact, I can't think of any mention of coming across like another commando who's a Jew, because you have to remember, they're not telling anyone they're Jews, right? So there's no way on God's green earth that they're going to make that connection. So let's say they're serving with some guy with a Jewish name who's talking about the East End or something that they know, tells them that they're Jewish. It's never going to happen because they're so deep undercover and they're all pretending to be British. So that didn't happen. So the relationships they build are with other commandos, but the main relationships that they build are with the Extroopers. So the Extroopers do stay in touch after the war, have regular reunion, but that, and I've also never been asked that question. It's such a good question, but it didn't happen because they were under too deep cover. So they might have wanted to hang out more with those guys. Of course they would, because Manfred Gans wrote about he wrote in his diary about Yom Kippur, and he had this Yom Kippur where he was going through these sewage drains, and it was sort of like the worst Yom Kippur imaginable. I'm sure he ate that day because he was under deep cover and he had to do really well as a commando. So you only get these little tiny mentions of the Jewishness after the war starts, and there's no way they're going to tell anyone else about it.
Right. So interesting. Thank you.
It's so interesting. Yeah.
And just actually following on from my question, Thelma has a question. Thelma Fry. Thelma, do you want to either put your video on or unmute?
Yes. How do I put my video on? I put my...
I will send you a request to ask you to start your video, and you just press yes.
Oh, I press start my video, yes?
Yeah. And
that's me. I see.
Lovely. And let me hold on 1 second and let me bring you up on screen. There we go. It's Thelma Ruby. No?
Yes, that's right. That's me. I hear you say that this was sort of the only collective Jewish fighting in the Second World War. You don't mention, because a cousin of mine was in it, that the Israelis, although they were very much against the British and what they'd done, they did form during the war a Jewish brigade.
Yeah, I talk about the Jewish Brigade in the book. Unfortunately, the British put them in really late, and they actually didn't accomplish very much. And I don't blame the Jewish Brigade. It's because the British didn't train them well. So they were sort of thrown into Italy. They did what they could. And one of the men I write about, his brother was in the Jewish Brigade, but it was sort of towards the end of the war. It's primarily in the Italian campaign, and they didn't get the serious training that the Extroopers got.
I see.
So I do talk about the British Brigade, and my wish is that the British had trained them as well as they trained the Extroop, but it didn't happen.
My cousin, who was
deep cover, so
my cousin who was in the Jewish Brigade then went back, and of course immediately joined the fight against the British.
Yeah, and that's right. And I should have mentioned that when people ask the question, I should say, look, the guys in the Jewish Brigade were the ones who brought the information.
They went back. In fact, he was killed leading the attack on Haifa, because he had army background from being in the Jewish Brigade.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, so I do talk about them, but you're right. That's where the crossover happens, is with the Jewish Brigade. Also because they're publicly Jewish, these guys are hiding it the whole time.
That's what's so interesting, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Thelma. So I'm going to ask one last question. So last week we had Peter Pomerantsev, who I don't know if you know, he's a journalist, he's now teaching at Johns Hopkins, and he's working on propaganda, the involvement of Jewish refugees, emigre refugees in the propaganda effort. And he was talking particularly about a certain group of emigre Jews who were put in Woburn Abbey, and their challenge was to create a radio station broadcasting to the Nazis as if they were Nazis. So they spent the whole of the war pretending to be Nazis. And one of the things he's looking at is the psychological impact this had on these Jewish emigres who'd already been through terrible things and then were forced into another identity, and actually in their case were forced to become the enemy. I mean, again, you are talking about already survivors, you know, people who have experienced terrible trauma, and then they have this kind of disassociative thing of they have to pretend to be something they're not. Then they're getting thrown into war. And I just wonder, like, were there repercussions down the line, and what was the impact of this on the rest of their lives?
Can I just say, I've done about 30 talks in my book, and I'm getting the best questions with this group that I've ever had. These questions are so good, and they're just so intelligent. So that's such a good question. Yes, it did have an impact. One of the men I read about, Colin Anson, talked about how when he was sent back to do the denazification efforts in 1945 in the town he had grown up with, he did this incredible quote about when he was walking back through the streets. He looks like a British commando. He talks like a British commando. He has this new fake name, so much so his mother, who he finds hidden, doesn't even recognize him and he said it was really haunting because I was walking the streets with my old identity walking next to me, and it was sort of like I didn't know who I was anymore. And I think that sense of not being sure who they were transcribes into the majority, particularly of the British, saying, I'm not going to talk about my background. I'm not going to talk about the Holocaust. I'm not going to use the name of my mother, you know, or whatever my birth name is. I'm going to become this British person through and through. And he talked about this sense that he felt of just profound insecurity, that he always had to prove himself that he was British, because he had to always prove himself as this commando, because as Emma mentioned, they constantly had to prove themselves. And I think in light of your question, it's helping me understand the book a bit better. I think this might have been a reason why the British commandos who stay in the UK found it so much harder to re-engage with their past than those who came into America. And then they could be American and they could like be public about it and embrace their childhoods and tell their kids about their parents and stuff like that. In the UK, overwhelmingly, they did not want to go there. And I reckon it's probably because of that sort of, I mean, literally they're chosen for this top secret mission, right? One of them says, it's the most absurd thing because I walk into the interview as part of the Pioneer Corps, where I'm not trusted to get told anything more serious than a shovel. And I walk out of the interview and I'm being told, you're going to be like a British commando at the front of the lines. And he talked about that. So I think for many of them, that was just such a profound moment. And then they're given 5 minutes to come up with a new name, new identity, Church of England. Then they're told to go back and get rid of anything they have that has their name on it. Get rid of their books, get rid of letters, one of the guys packs his Tolleson to fill it into a box and sends it away. They're given fake addresses. They have no more contact with anyone. And I think that shows up after the war in this profound fear to talk about their Jewish roots. I don't know, but I'm understanding it better as you ask that question. I think that maybe that's why it was so different for those in the UK because they had to continually be British in the UK, but in America, they could try and reinvent themselves again. Wait, you're muted.
I know, here I am telling everyone else to unmute, and of course I forget. So thank you very much. I mean, it is really interesting to me, and I think the other thing that just I'm thinking about is, plus they've had this period in the Isle of Man where they've been interned for specifically being a threat to British life because they're
and that's
German.
what the guy who said he's more British than the British, he talked about that, the internment and having to go through that. I call that chapter Locked Behind Barbed Wire, because that's how they saw it. They knew that they were being locked behind barbed wires and enemies. So I think you're totally right that translated into this sort of disassociation.
How many were there of them?
The number varies depending on which war diaries I look at, but it looks like there was between like 84 and 120. Hundreds more were interviewed, but this was the ones who were selected.
Wow. Wow. So, oh, I've just seen the time. We've only got 5 minutes left. So I'd love to ask a little bit more about that selection process, but you know what? I'm going to have to read the book. So let's have that as the advert to everyone. And just to say, I normally hate recommending Amazon because I really want to support independent bookshops. But in this case, this is a book that you can get via Amazon, where I think a lot of the smaller indie ones might not be able to stock it. So
yeah, this came out with Penguin. So yeah, it came out with Penguin. So Amazon, if you just type in Extroop, hopefully there's not another one there, Extroop Leah Garrett, and then you'll find it.
Fabulous. So please do buy the book. And just to ask as the last question to you before I advertise what's on next, what's next for you? Are you going to take this project any further or do anything else?
So because I've been in a fighting mood those last 6 months, I want to keep doing Fighting Jews. So I've discovered this totally marginally unknown story about Jewish gangsters in London. We know about the ones who fought Mosley, and Jewish gangsters in the United States who fought fascists. So I'm going to write a book about all these Jewish gangsters who used their fists and their, lead pipes and stuff to fight off the fascist threat in both the UK and the United States. That's the next book.
Well, you've just given me a perfect link there, because we've just had a program on a TV series actually on in the UK on the
Ridley Road.
Ridley Road.
Yes.
So the showrunner of that, Sarah Soleimani, is going to be speaking, actually interviewed by Nathan Abrams, funnily enough.
Are you serious?
Is going to be speaking for Jewish Renaissance in December. So please do everyone come along. And the book that was based on, that novel was based on, which looks at the 42 group and the 63 group, was written by Jo Bloom. And actually we interviewed her and did it for our book club when that book first came out. So if anyone's interested, you can look on our YouTube channel and you'll also find the interview with Jo Bloom. But Leah, we must invite you along to see Nathan interview Sarah about that.
Send me a link to that. I will 100% be there.
Fabulous. And please, everyone else, join us. And if you want to carry on next week exploring the World War II era, amazing Jewish refugee soldiers and all the roles they played. Next week, we've got Helen Fry coming along. And what we've asked her, she's going to give a big review of the role of emigre Jews' involvement in World War II, but her special focus is going to be on what she calls the secret listeners. So the projects which actually were the foundations of GCHQ in Cheltenham, which now we look at going, how much they're listening into our communications and monitoring our computers. But this all started off in Trent Park with German Jewish emigres listening in to conversations of Nazis. To try and find out intelligence. So Helen's going to do a deep dive into that next week. Please do come along.
And Helen is wonderful. I couldn't have done my work without the work of Helen. I'm just going to plug her. She's fabulous. She's the best.
Brilliant. I love it. We've got a complete love in her. Well, thank you so much, Leah. And big thank you to Emma for interviewing you. But
thank you, Emma.
For you for sharing such amazing knowledge. And thank you to all our audience. And we hope you'll come back. We'd love to see you again next week. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.